All right. Greg, this is our last session of the day, so you're going to have to
Hope it's not the graveyard slot.
put it all together for us, put a bow on it. Of course, at Resonance, we produce a ranking. We're either naive enough or audacious enough to produce a ranking of world cities. But you've written 10 books about cities. You've worked with 300 cities around the world. I really want to dive in, talk a little bit, take us back to the 50,000-foot view of what's next for world cities.
Fantastic, Chris. Well, firstly, I just want to say thank you to these people for still being here right at the end of the day. And I really want to congratulate you. I think this has been a fantastic event, and I've had a great day being here, so thank you for the invitation. And I do want to do exactly what you've just said, because so much of what I've heard today has been resonant, fascinating, and compelling. So why don't we try to put this whole conversation into a different framework? So I want to talk about 100 years. I'd like to talk about the whole world, not the 10% of the world that lives in Europe and North America. And I want to really focus on this idea of recovery versus reinvention. And I think the conversation we've been having today is one that says, actually, we're not talking about the recovery of cities as if cities were sick and in hospital and need to get better and take their medicine and come out. Actually, what we're discovering is that we've embarked on a completely new trajectory for our cities, and we're in a moment of reinvention. So I'm going to talk about quite a few things in the conversation.
We only have 25 minutes.
I know, right? We've got 25 minutes, right. And I'm going to be quick. Let me start by just showing a couple of slides just to paint the picture. So we're talking about the century of the city. And a few people earlier today spoke about different time frames. I'm taking 1980 to 2080 as a 100-year period. In 1980, as you can see, 2.3 billion people are living in cities. In 2080, 9.3 billion. 2.3 billion to 9.3 billion in a 100-year period. You can see that there are 275 cities with more than 1 million people in 1980. There are 1,600 cities with more than 1 million people in 2080. And you can see which parts of the world are the fastest urbanizing and what's going on. And I can tell you today, North America, Latin America, Europe, Oceania, 81, 82, 83% urbanized. India, 37%, right? Africa, 45%. ASEAN, up to 47%. China and the Middle East into the kind of 64%. There's a long way to go for the rest of the world to reach a kind of peak urbanization that probably is going to be 85, 89, 90% what you see in Singapore, Japan, South Korea, and elsewhere. So there's a long way to go on this urbanization journey. And my second couple of slides are just show you what's happening post-pandemic. And this is really my point, that this is not about the recovery of cities. It's about the reinvention of cities. And don't bother to read the boxes. By the way, the charts will be available to you. Just look at the color schemes. You see, we've been talking today about North American and European cities, which are in a sense the laggards in this reinvention process, right? The Middle East cities, the ASEAN cities, the Chinese cities, where you'll see more of the green dots, they are accelerating back towards public transport usage, active transport uses, enjoying all of the amenities of their central cities, which are changing in the same ways as they are in the West. Many more people back to the office, right? And so if you like, there's another way of looking at all of this, which is to say that the South is now in the lead and the North is following the South for the first time in a long time. So just hold that perspective for a minute. And then the last thing I really want to say about all of this is that, we've talked a lot today about what makes cities compelling. And I think it makes sense for us to think about a kind of magic of cities. So we'll talk about the century of cities, the magic of cities. There's also the poison of cities, which we'll come back to. But the magic of cities is this social capital, civic capital, and trust, this reinventive capability that the whole conference is all about. By sharing places, sharing systems, sharing spaces, we develop a trust, a creativity, an inventiveness that doesn't exist outside the city, right? The city is the place of invention and reinvention. And on top of all of that, of course, the enduring magic of the city, the agglomeration effects that make labor and capital and firms more productive, the network effects that change behaviors very quickly, that exchange tacit information, the scale effects that give you elite hospitals or fantastic universities or incredible culture. All of those things that we've become so used to enjoying, these are facets of the magic of cities that is now in charge of the reinvention process, I would say. We can take the slides down now.
So these major macro trends, it's interesting hearing you talk about ASEAN cities leading ahead of North American, European cities. I mean, what do you see as the big choices in front of us then as cities moving forward?
Well, very well put, Chris. And so I'm looking at a world which in 2080 is almost 10 billion people living in roughly 10,000 cities. Now, if that's where we're looking, then what's the big choice? The big choice is, firstly, is there an alternative to that model? Do you want those 10 billion people to live in 20,000, 40,000, 100,000 towns and villages? Or do you want them to live in 10,000 cities? If you think that them living in 10,000 cities is going to be the best thing for humanity if we can reinvent the cities, then the question becomes, how do we get good urbanization rather than bad urbanization? So I think good urbanization is when we plan cities, we invest in cities, we build cities, we invest in the infrastructure that they need, so that the carrying capacity of the city, it's an ecological term, but the carrying capacity of the city never exceeds or is never exceeded by the population that's there. Too frequently, though, what we've seen in the last 100 years is bad urbanization, where the population growth exceeds the carrying capacity of the city, and that's what produces congestion, gridlock, poor air quality, infrastructure stress, segregation, which I'm sure we're going to come back to in a minute, as well as, of course, all of the other challenges that we see. So if you like, the big choice is if we want good urbanization rather than bad urbanization, are we prepared to equip our cities for the population growth they're about to receive that you've seen on the charts? And if we're prepared to do that, then there's a whole series of interesting consequences that occur. I think that's the one big choice, Chris. There are many others, but...
So over the last couple of days, you've been our roving reporter, if you will, talking to leaders in Amsterdam, Tel Aviv, Barcelona, Sydney, other cities around the world. What have been some of the kind of recurring themes as you talk to these different leaders, their perspective on what the future of world cities looks like?
Well, let me just say there's something about their mood and their perspective that's similar to everyone who's been on this stage today, which is that broadly speaking, people are sober about the challenges, but really optimistic about the future. And I think that the reason people are optimistic is because they realize in their bones, this is reinvention, it's not recovery. So we don't have to take heavy medicine for the next 10 years and go to rehab and everything else. Actually, we have to get on with the reinvention process. So they're really excited about that. But let's go on a quick tour. So in Sydney, Elizabeth Mildwater talks brilliantly about planning for a 6-city region, not a 1-city region. And I think this is one of the chiming stories for the second half of the century of the city, that we'll plan places that have multiple cities and towns in them, not single cities. That she talks about that. Yuning Huang in Singapore, and obviously all the videos that will be available, she talks a lot about human-centered planning and the intricacy with which in Singapore they're planning the next 1.5 million people that are coming to that city. 6.5 million people today, grown from less than 1 million people in 1964 at independence, right? And the delicious, almost exquisite detail with which they plan with the people, really, really interesting. Tel Aviv, a big conversation about metropolitanization. How do we now, the Tel Aviv miracle, the technology miracle that's driving their economy, how do we now create a metropolitan system to do that? And they start with transport infrastructure, very interestingly. Barcelona, the story from Mateo Hernandez is, we love this reinvention process because people who used to work in cold cities in Europe now want to live in Barcelona and work from Barcelona, but not in Barcelona. So he's having a bit of the Miami effect, right? He's feeling the love of all sorts of entrepreneurs wanting to be there. And then, of course, Geerte Udo, who spoke to us about Amsterdam, she talks about civilizing the city, creating a much more livable, much more humane city, a city that prioritizes the smaller people and the smaller spaces. She does that very brilliantly. But I think there's all sorts of things that come out from this, Chris, and if I could put it very simply, I would say that what all of them have said in one way or another is that we're in the process of building, or perhaps sowing, a kind of new social contract for cities. So if you remember, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, back in the 1700s, develops this idea of the social contract as the new underpinning of democracy, that if you like, there's a contract between the people and the leadership that's based on an exchange of responsibilities and trust. And what they're really saying, I think, is that the city is developing a new social contract. The people in this room are part of that, but we know quite a lot about what the elements of that are.
Are there any, you talk about reinvention versus recovery. As you talk to these various cities, are they all on that same mindset?
Absolutely they are. And of course, if you go back to my maps of earlier, Chris, you saw that Shanghai, you saw that the Chinese cities now, the South Korean cities, the Japanese cities, the cities in ASEAN, the cities in the Middle East, they're all back to 94, 95, 96% occupancy in their offices. They're all back to, what we would see as the old ways of coming in and out of the city. That doesn't mean that they're not reinventing. They are reinventing at the same time, but they're reinventing the quality. And I would put this at its most simple, if I can, that I think there's a big switch going on that they're all participating, which is a switch from our cities primarily serving commuters, consumers, and corporates, if you like, the old business model of the city, and they're shifting towards something else that still serves those groups, but it's more a qualitative effect. It's about habitat. It's about how well can you live in this city, how well can nature live in this city. It's about experience, so it's not about the efficiency of the transaction, it's about the quality of the experience that you have in the city, and it's about innovation. It's about the things that have to be done face-to-face and face-to-place. So if you like, the reinvention of the city is a movement from this old business model of we're an efficient place for certain kinds of transactions to occur, and it's a shift towards a rich experience, innovation, and habitat sort of proposition. And I would say that all of those cities are somehow on that journey. They may or may not use that language.
So we have to go through this, reinvention. At the same time, looking at your stats, we're also going through this mass urbanization of billions of people at the same time. Isn't that a little bit like building the airplane while you're taking off?
It's exactly that, isn't it? And that's why people want to be in a conference like this and why this story resonates, right? Because we know that you can't stop urbanization. I mean, you could try to stop urbanization. And of course, there are people who are anti-urbanists. There are probably not many in this room, but there are people.
Oh, we didn't let them in.
No, well, there are people who think that actually, there's a certain kind of technology optimist who thinks that in the end, technology does away with place and space. But this is only if you're focusing on the efficiency quotient, not if you're focusing on the experience, the innovation, or the habitat proposition, which is why cities shift towards that. But I would put it another way, Chris, and simply say that we do have to fix the ship while we're in air. The good news is, I think, that we know how we need to fix it, and we have some new tools. So if I could just talk about that for a minute. So I spoke about a new social contract for cities, and I think every single one of the 10 elements of the new social contract has been spoken about already in this room today. So I wrote them down while I was sitting there. Number one, decarbonization and arresting climate distress. Number two, human health, especially air quality and livable buildings and cities. Number three, giving the cars their proper place, i.e. a much smaller place than the one they've had, and reanimating our streets. Number four, homes, affordable, livable, in the right places. Number five, segregation, dealing with segregation in the city in such a way that we enjoy the fruits of integration. The promise of the city, the promise of proximity, is that you get to be with people who are different from you, not that you get to be isolated. By the way, this is the big risk with the 15-minute city, which I'm a skeptic of, right?
Sure.
Because I think that you could end up with a rich person's 15-minute city and a poor person's 15-minute city, and I think they could be very different things. So the 15-minute city, yes, but within a 45-minute metropolis that creates that social capital and that sharing. Very quickly, number 6, gender. By the way, this is not a priority order, but having cities that are safe for women and girls to work, to travel, to exercise their freedoms is really essential to the second half of the century of the city. Nature, food, water is number 7. Resilience and the co-creation of our resilience platforms, and particularly how we integrate nature into that. Then, of course, there's agility and flexibility, and the 10th one is about public space and a new sense of the commons. And I think these 10 elements are sort of what is emerging as this new social contract. It will take a decade, I think, for this to get really articulated into something that is sort of widely understood, but I think the people in this room are the kind of pioneers of this story. And then very quickly, if I may, I think there are 3 new tools that join us for the second half of the century of the city. So number 1 is obviously exponential enabling technologies. We heard about that in an earlier session. The power of digital twins. It was brilliantly, I think, explained here. But the relationship between, let's say, digital twins and the decarbonization of the built environment or the transport system is very, very clear. So we have amazing technologies that we didn't have before. Number 2, and I don't know if this is going to be a popular comment, but number 2, I think, is that the private sector has woken up to the opportunity and the imperative to reinvent our cities by investing in them at a new level. If you like, the private sector understands that the license to operate is derived from the social contract. And if you don't support the social contract, you don't have a license to operate. And, you know, I pay a lot of attention to the 140 trillion that was pledged at Glasgow as part of COP to invest in the decarbonization processes by 2050. That is more money than the private sector has ever pledged for anything. And the boot is now on their foot to find the investable projects. So for everyone who works in a city, the opportunity now is to find the thing that's bankable for them. And then the third new thing, I think, the new part of the toolbox, is what I would call the new art of place leadership. Now, there are a lot of people in this room who practice this. Whether you call it place leadership or not, I don't know. But I think we're moving away from a moment when cities were managed by city governments or port authorities or airport authorities or big real estate operators or owners of big campuses, if you like, a sectoral approach to managing cities. And we're moving towards much more integrated and collaborative leadership that has business and government and institutions, but also right at the heart of its citizens. And that's how I think we rebuild social capital through collaborative place leadership. Many practitioners here in the room, but let's stop and think. 10 and 20 years ago, we didn't really know that that could happen. And we relied a lot on municipal governments to solve problems, or national governments, or big institutions. Actually, now we realize that the city is an ecosystem and it requires collaborative leadership.
So it sounds like you've authored here a new World City Declaration for the city that we can maybe publish here later on. And you've talked about 3 tools to help us get there.
Yeah.
So imagine 10 years from now, we go ahead and we resolve and implement a lot of these different things.
Yeah.
What do you think will be some of the next issues, or what will be the big issues if we're at World City, this conference, a decade from now? What will we be talking about, and how do you think we'll be maybe going about resolving those issues?
Well, Chris, there are massive debates and dilemmas out there, right? And they're enough to keep all of us awake every night of our lives with stress. But I suppose the thing I would say firstly is that I'm particularly interested in the concept of a world city, which is why I was so attracted to your invitation to join you in this venture. And a world city is a city that is open to international flows, right? Flows of people, flows of capital, flows of ideas, flows of knowledge, flows of workers, flows of trade. A world city is a city that is thinking and acting beyond its own national borders. I think we're going to have 1,000 world cities in 10 years' time. And 10 years ago, I was writing reports that said there are 6 world cities and there are lots of wannabes, right? I think we'll have 1,000 world cities. Despite all of this talk about deglobalization, actually it's the city that is pro-globalization, but it's a social kind of globalization. And then there are some very big debates, okay? So let's be very clear about this. Is the good urbanization that I spoke about really feasible? Am I right that 10 billion people living in 10,000 cities is the best way to accommodate human population growth? Does technology do away with the need for proximity, or does it enrich it and heighten it and make it livable? Does technology help us deliver good urbanization, or does it provide an alternative? There's also going to be very big debates, of course, about whether we prioritize decarbonization or resilience, or whether we can do both things together. This debate is out there now already, and I think people in this room are probably engaging with it. The other big debate is whether national governments will, in the end, decide to empower the municipal tier more. I mean, obviously, when you're talking about this in North America, I mean, in Canada, as you know, the cities have much less power than they do in the US. But in the US, they get so indebted at various points of time that the states create, real restrictions on them. On average, only 5% of the cities in the world have the tools, competencies, legal frameworks, fiscal capabilities that they need for the challenge that's ahead. So will national governments decide to empower them, or will we see the revolt of the cities against the nation state, right? In the next 60 years, we have to think about, will the nation state really prevail? And I think this will be one of the touchstones. So that's a few of the debates and dilemmas. There are many, many more.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree with you more about this shift from 6 world cities or 10 or whatever in our top 10 to 1,000 world cities.
Yeah.
Isn't that sort of maybe one of the biggest shifts is sort of this flattening of the hierarchy of cities in terms of that pecking order, that less gateway cities and just more world cities around the world. What does that mean as we think about, in the near term, you said you weren't a fan of the 15-minute city, but if we looked at this agenda, we look at these long-term issues, these long-term trends, if I'm a developer or I'm an investor, what should I be looking at in the next 5 years in terms of where would I be focusing on development and thinking about opportunities and what the shape of the city is going to take in the near term as we start this reinvention?
Yeah, fantastic question. So I think there's a number of things that are sort of obvious to people. Okay, the complete reorientation of our downtowns into, whether you call them central experience districts or central social districts or central innovation districts, they use different language for this in every part of the world, but the complete reinvention of the downtown is a massive opportunity, right? We move from consumers, consumption, and corporates to habitat, innovation, and experience. That's a massive opportunity to create much more value, right? Much more value. Similar proposition, of course, for second-tier cities, third-tier cities, suburban locations, and others. The densification opportunities that come with the opportunity to host activities that are now more mobile and more agile as a consequence of the big acceleration that we've seen. And I think that's a great opportunity for all of those places. Of course, if you go to any real estate conference, and I go to all of them, they'll tell you meds, digital data, logistics, and everything else. Of course, those things are growing. But I'm not sure that they're not already saturated. So I think if you're a developer, my real advice would be focus on the DNA of the place that you're in and build something unique, spectacular, human scale, the sorts of things that have been talked about in this room. Don't go for copying, go for pioneering is obviously the key bit. I think what you will see, though, and I mentioned capital as a kind of new part of the toolbox, this $140 trillion is looking for assets to invest in. So if you are a developer or a real estate operator, or you are trying to develop a new district or to reinvent an existing district, get capital sitting on the same side of the table as you as soon as possible, because there's a real hunger there to make a difference and to do something, extraordinary.
You talked about sort of this new model in terms of place leadership, place governance, public sector, private sector. Are there any examples out there that we can look to today amongst cities around the world that you think are leading the way?
Well, I think there are hundreds, literally. But, if you go back to our friend Mateo Hernandez, who spoke at lunchtime today about the future of Barcelona. So he runs an organization called Barcelona Global. It's not a government organization. It has 6,000 citizens, all of the universities, all of the faith groups, the big companies, the medium-sized companies in it. Their only focus is the future of Barcelona. So this is a civic organization thinking about the future of the city, and they partner with the city government and with the state government to do all sorts of projects, including a new agency to attract all of these people who want to work from Barcelona if they don't live there. So that's one example. You could look at what's happened in Medellin with, the community-based redevelopment process that's happened there, and how the city government and the private sector has really focused on supporting that. And I think, you could also look at some of the really interesting things that have happened in the city of Manchester in the United Kingdom, where I live, where public, private, civic, and institutional partners have come together for this kind of future of Manchester approach. So I think you see it happening at the big scale of metropolitan areas. You see it happening at the level of whole cities. But you see it in that tactical urbanism in small places, car parks that are turned into places where people can grow vegetables, or railway arches that become community facilities. I think that it's part of the new agility that is part of this reinventiveness that this place leadership is finding its role. And actually, Chris, we should develop some great case studies of this, because there's a lot of it around.
Yeah, I think another example that comes to mind for me is Toronto, with creating Toronto Inc. and bringing different government agencies, municipality together as they look at fastest growing city in the Americas. And determining what that future looks like requires more collaboration between these different agencies and not just the municipality. Working together. Yeah,
so if you and I were sitting down next week to develop a new city ranking, it should be a ranking of collaborative capability of the city to develop a new kind of place leadership for its place. Yeah?
All right. Well, my whole research team is now just going home. Greg gave us another job to do. Chris is going to want a new ranking. Anyway. Well, thanks so much for coming here and sharing your thoughts. I think it was a great way to tie so much content, so many speakers together. I know we could sit here for an hour. All the talks that Greg had with the various cities are available on demand on the app, so you can play those back at any time. I encourage you to do so and follow the pathway of all the conversations that led today. So thanks so much for joining us and wrapping this up for us today on our last session at World City.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. I love Paul's quote about being sober about the challenges, but optimistic about the future. I think that rings really true for me, and I hope it does for you. As we come to a close for day 2, our final day at World City, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to all of you, both in this room and online around the world, for joining us today and yesterday, and for those of you who are joining us in person tomorrow for some of the tours. Thank you to all of the remarkable speakers for joining us and being part of something so special. I don't know about you, but I don't work in this industry, but now I really want to. For any of you who will be joining the tours tomorrow, Little Island, Meatpacking District, Greenpoint, and the Tin Building, keep an eye on your inbox for reminders and details. If you haven't signed up for a tour and you would like to join one, please see Shannon at the front desk. So, finally, I would like to thank Chris Fair and the Resonance team for making World City happen. Not only did they produce the event, he's here.
And thank you to Christina for co-hosting.
Wait, I wasn't finished my script. Okay, fine. Okay,
I'm tired of reading off these cards,
That's
to be honest.
fine.
I've been so well behaved.
We said we were going to burn them.
But thank you, Christina, for being a fantastic host, stimulating a lot of conversations and connections. Thanks again to all the sponsors and partners. And I do want to thank our team at Resonance. We're not an event company. We are strategy, consulting, branding, marketing. This
Finders
is the first
of
time
phones.
we did Finders of Phones.
Yeah.
But reinventing what events look like was part of our mission, and this grand experiment that you've all been a part of I think it's been great to have a community. We talk a lot about community, building community, creating community, but we don't actually talk much about community amongst ourselves in this industry of professional placemaking, whether you're an architect, designer, developer, prop tech, et cetera. So bringing ourselves together was really what the motivation and inspiration for World City was all about, and it was fantastic to have a live in-person audience here, joining all of you that have joined us online in the years past, and we look forward to continuing this conversation, but more importantly, look forward to building this community with you in the months and years to come. So we encourage you to follow World City, stay part of it. Hopefully we'll be announcing some other interesting events in other places around the world, and you can stay tuned and follow us, and we hope to see you somewhere in the world out there in the months to come. Thanks again for coming, everyone.